Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to Versus Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. And remember, click that subscribe button, everybody. This is a very special episode because Jerry Ordway boards the mothership. In this episode, we celebrate the legendary death of Superman storyline. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Ordway. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's totally my honor, sir. I'm a big fan of yours, and I actually had the pleasure of getting one of your autographs. I believe was it Plastic City Comic Con, I think, some years ago.
Yep. That was probably maybe now it's got to be like 4 or 5 years, right?
Maybe. Oh yeah, it had to be pre-COVID. So we're going
Yeah.
back a few years. It doesn't seem that long, but I keep forgetting there's like a 2 or 3 year gap where everything
Yeah.
just kind of fell apart and was forgotten.
That's true. It was is it I think at the time it was when I was there, it was in a like a
Yes,
hockey arena or something.
certainly. It was in a hockey arena. But actually, I remember I still have your autographs on my wall behind me if
Cool.
you can't see it on here, but it's right back here. I had one issue of Adventure of Superman, one of the Doomsday issues, and then one of the
Mhm.
funeral for a friend was that came right after.
Oh, cool. Yep.
So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love of comics and who are your earliest influences?
Well, when I was a little kid, I think I mean most kids like comics, like the idea of them, but when I was growing up, it would be early 60s when I was really little. I think that the specter of uh the comic book stuff in the 50s, the Wortham stuff was still kind of strong. And my mom wasn't, she was kind of protective. So I remember very specifically being at a train station or a bus station for a trip, and she wouldn't let me buy anything except a cartoon, like a Dell comic, which would
Yeah.
be some kind of cartoon character or whatever. And I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I do think that there was still kind of a holdover, being early 60s. There was still that feeling like, oh, comics might, somehow derange my kid. I really liked the idea of drawing even from a very young age. So I think my first drawings, which I don't have, but I was told I would draw little figures, like basically a round figure, like an M&M, character, something with arms and legs. But I discovered mostly, I think the most impactful stuff was Marvel Comics through the cartoon show in 1966, which was on, syndication, the Marvel superheroes. And they just struck me in a way. You look at them now, they're pretty crappy, but they were exciting as a, 9-year-old, I guess. It was pretty amazing. And then a year later, 67, I discovered the actual Marvel comics. And in between there, we had the Batman TV show, which I thought was the best thing ever. And all of that kind of had me drawing, So the first people that I noticed, I'd say art wise, would have been, I think, the two books that when I saw them on a newsstand that amazed me, and I picked them up even though I didn't know anything about them, was Daredevil, and that was Gene Colan, Daredevil number 29, I think it was, but he was being unmasked on the cover. And I remember as a, again, like a little kid trying to figure out how he could wear these big sunglasses as they were pulling his mask off. He's like, wait, how do you have them? It intrigued me enough to buy that. The other one was Spider-Man walking away from his costume in the comics. He's in the alley, costumes in a garbage can. It was like, wait, this is my first issue, but he's already quit. it was kind of mind blowing. So those two artists, John Romita Sr. and Gene Colan, were the first ones I think that just kind of made me, want to draw. But then, John Buscema and Wally Wood and Jack Kirby and Gil Kane and all those guys from that era were very important to me, development wise. But just initially, it would have probably been John Romita Sr. with Spider-Man and Gene Colan with Daredevil.
Well, it's so cool when you hear a comic book fan become, once again, a legendary writer, which is what you've become. And my year is correct. In 1987, you started writing The Adventures of Superman. So how did you get involved writing Superman?
when I first started the comic, I was working with Marv Wolfman, or after John Byrne's reboot. So I started with Adventures of Superman number 424, and Marv was the writer. And I kept trying to get Marv to let me co-plot, and we actually did. I co-plotted the Legends crossover because Marv either was busy. I don't remember what the thing was, but he didn't work on that one. So that would have been like maybe the third, even it was very early in the run. And I worked on that one with Byrne and plotted a version of it, sent it in, and then Byrne added to it, changed it around, and it came back to me. So I always wanted to do that. I always wanted and I always had ideas, but when you're young and you're the new guy or whatever, you're kind of like a little afraid to throw your ideas out there, so someone's going to go, "That's stupid." But so I just built confidence a little by little in working on Superman. And by the second year, when Byrne had assumed writing, he was totally cool with me doing co-plotting. And by that point, I'd also moved from Wisconsin to Connecticut so I could be close enough to do story stuff, because they like that. They like you being closer to the office so you can have face-to-face communications and things. So I moved to Connecticut, and Byrne lived in Fairfield at the time. I was living up in West Haven, which is near New Haven. So it was a short drive to come and hang out and talk over stories. So when John quit, Mike Carlin said, "Who do you want to work with?" And I gave him a couple of names of writers that I liked. And then he said, "Well, why don't you do it?" And I was like, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, you already know how to, the storyline." So he said, "I'll help you." So basically, at that point, I had to get a typewriter. I didn't have a typewriter. And I just had to, I had like a trial by fire. Especially the very first two issues of things that I wrote, Mike very heavily edited because he had a better eye for how much would fit in a balloon, basically. There's a balance when you look at a comic. You don't want the balloons and the copy to overwhelm the art. And he thought I was being too wordy, and he was right. So I learned a lot. It was a crash course just in that short space. But I think the second one I did, I was thinking, I really got to quit. This is crazy. This is crazy. And I was like, no, I can't quit. People are counting on me. And so by the third or fourth, I was a little bit, more confident, and he wasn't editing it as heavily either. So I felt like maybe I was doing something right. But I was lucky too, because we worked, Roger Stern stepped in to replace John on the Superman book. And Roger and I had worked together on a couple issues of Fantastic Four. So we kind of knew each other a little bit. And, everybody was kind of on the same page. So it really made for a kind of an easy transition. Again, when I was a fan artist, I always wrote and drew my stories. I always had ideas, so I think that maybe I wasn't hungry enough for it right away. I wanted to do whatever I was going to do. I wanted to do it well. And I felt like, my first bunch of years were learning, you never go into something and immediately think you know what you're doing. I mean, it's really is a process. And even all these years later, I still feel like I'm learning. I don't really feel like I know what I'm doing. I can fake it better.
Well, thing is, when you're first writing gigs, it's for Superman, who is by far one of the most legendary characters in comics, if not the most legendary in history.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel the weight of what you were trying to do?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that was different was that I had already been working on it for almost 2 years at that point. I think if it had been pitched, or if I'd been pitched, "Oh, you want to write and draw it," it would have been harder to do it as a startup. But that's why I say I think I got a little bit of a time to ease into it. And by the time I started writing it, I knew the characters really well, and I knew kind of what I wanted to do. So I think that's probably the difference. And yeah, the weight of it is crazy because I think I felt that when I first started drawing it, more so because the Byrne relaunch was a little bit polarizing. At conventions, you would get a lot of fans who were absolutely angry that that they would restart it. For one thing, it's all justifiable stuff. When you're a comic fan, you want the story that you read 2 years ago to kind of count towards some big continuity or whatever. So, but when I did it, I mean, when I first was announced for Superman in the first issue, I had people that I knew for years. In my previous job in commercial art, they'd contact me and they'd say, "Wow, Superman," because everybody knows Superman.
Right.
So, it's not like someone's saying, you're going to draw even, I don't know, when you pick something like Metamorpho or something, people would be like, "What? Who?" With Superman, everybody immediately knows Clark Kent, Krypton, Lois Lane, Daily Planet. It's like, you understand that there's a legacy that you're adding to, and that it is a big deal, especially at that time. I mean, I don't think I think nobody was giving people off the street a chance to do Superman at that point. I don't know if I feel like maybe it hasn't changed, but there was always an awesome pressure to a degree.
So when you started writing for Superman, the character had existed for 49 years, if my math is correct. He has been portrayed like a godlike character. He's been portrayed like the humble farm boy. He's been portrayed in so many different ways in between. In the movies, obviously, he's a little gruffer in the current ones, that were the most recent ones. When you're thinking about writing for Superman, what characteristic, which trait is your entryway into understanding him?
Oh, it was that was, I felt very simple, because my first, I would say, even though I wasn't a huge Superman comic fan, because I was a big Marvel, I was kind of like a Marvel zombie. But I was familiar with it. I saw the George Reeves TV show in reruns when I was a kid and even as an adult. But the Superman movie, the first one with Christopher Reeve, was mind blowing to me, and all of the warmth of the movie, the Smallville scenes, the interplay between his parents, even though it's a different actor as Clark Kent or whatever. I mean, all of that was so rich and Norman Rockwell-esque. I think that was really my touchstone for the entire time. And it also was, John Byrne's touchstone as well. I mean, that was, for both of us, we were both huge, huge fans of the movie. And I think that becomes kind of like it's almost shorthand at a certain point. That Clark Kent is going to be acting a certain way. It also helped that I was grew up in the Midwest. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I understood the transition of going from a smaller city to New York City, for example. So a lot of that kind of comes into play. You get a sense of just that, first time you go to New York City and you're on the sidewalk, it's like, you're looking up at these buildings and it's inspiring, and it's like, oh, this is Clark Kent seeing Metropolis, especially from street level. Walking into the Daily Planet rather than flying over it, as Superman. Everything's different at street level than it is from an airplane view or whatever. So, but yeah, that was that will always, I think, remain my touchstone for the characters. Just that first movie, and how Christopher Reeve played the character afterwards, even though I didn't care for the movies after. The first movie just had like a magic to it.
Since you brought it up, I'm just out of curiosity. I mean, who knows what the real answer would be? Do you think Superman as a character would have as much appreciation for Metropolis flying over it as he did walking through it?
Yeah, no, I think you have to experience stuff at street level, and I think that maybe the difference between the '60s version of Superman or even the '50s version of Superman to what we were trying to do is exactly that. I think the idea of an alien superhero flying over something, looking down on it, is much different than somebody who's on street level talking to people, you know. I think that that 1950s version of Superman had a bit of definitely had a lot of arrogance in him, just the way that he was written, you know, and he was always very kind of arrogant about Lois Lane and, you know, I'm Superman. He was definitely that grandfather's version of Superman, and we were trying to do something that was a little more relatable.
Mm.
Um, and that was a big part of us. I mean, that was my favorite part of doing the book, was to do Suicide Slum, which was rechristened as Hobbs Bay, the kind of, you know, poorer section or working class section or what have you of Metropolis, which we hadn't seen. It's not the shiny, you know, New York City, Broadway and all that stuff. It's more of, here's where people live and here's where people struggle to get by, and that. And that was childhood stuff for me, because I grew up in a neighborhood like that, and my mom had a tavern in a neighborhood that was totally changing, you know, from the time we were little to when I graduated high school. Just a forgotten kind of neighborhood in any city, you know, where you really don't, you know, crime rises and all that, but the people outside of it look at it differently than the people who live there. You know, for us, it was home. So a lot of that kind of always, I think, always creeps into the Superman stuff.
You know, I think that the most difficult aspect, I think, maybe of for some people to wrap their heads around when it comes to Superman, is the idea that here's a man who is so godlike. So, you know, and like as you mentioned, flying above, constantly having to save the relatively weak humans. The fact that he can still view them as equals and not something to, I don't want to say pets, but you know what I'm saying, something that's beneath him on some level, is
Yeah.
perhaps the hardest thing to figure psychologically for the character.
Yeah. Well, and again, that element I think is in the Christopher Reeve performance, in that, you know, he has humility, and I think that being that type of character, that's a total that's a result of the Kents raising him.
Mm.
You know, there's a certain kind of mindset of, you know, you could be the sports star, you could be the big guy in town or whatever, but you're never too big for, you know, the average guy or whatever. You know, you don't want to be the braggart, you don't want to be the, you know, the bully or whatever. So Clark was always the main guy to me, you know, and Superman was the character that he portrayed.
Mm.
And I think that the fact that he also found out in the, you know, in our comics, he finds out and in the movie he finds out that he's from another planet when he's a teenager, you know, or he's a young adult. I think that you could relate that to someone who was adopted, finding out they were adopted at a later stage and going, oh wait, now who are my parents? You know, I think my gut feeling would be that you would still feel like the people who raised you were your parents, but then you have biological parents, and that kind of adds a different aspect to your background or whatever. But it shouldn't change who you are. So that's why I think that Superman being raised in that kind of small town or that, you know, rural environment is the key to his character. I mean, even Byrne, you had him playing football and things like that, kind of before his powers really kind of manifest. And there's a great line in the movie where, you know, Pa Kent, right, he tells Clark that, you know, you can throw a football further, you can do all these things, but you have a different purpose. All those lines to me were very iconic and impactful sitting in a theater. So that aspect of Superman has always felt very real to me, you know, even though it is a fantasy character. And I think that helps. Maybe the stories that we did felt a little more grounded in that way. And that was a result of it, I think, you know, starting with Clark as the main real guy, like being an actor almost, you know, he's not Superman, but he plays one on TV or something, you know?
You know, and I mean, also, like I said, it was a great honor to write for Superman. You talk about how much you appreciate it. You also had one of the distinctions of being able to be the ones who killed him. Uh, so obviously, there's a lot of stories about how that all played out, and I got to interview Mike Carlin about it. I got to interview Louise Simonson about it. So I want to hear it from you. How did this come about? What do you remember about that period of time when you
Well,
were first brought it up, the conception of the idea, and kind of those first baby steps to actually going ahead and doing it?
well, the first thing to understand is that before the death of Superman, we did multiple crossovers within our titles. And the reason for that was we wanted more attention. We were getting good, response from readers, but we were not selling in the comic stores. The comic stores had no use for us, basically. So most of our sales were still on the newsstands. So DC would like to have the direct sales because that was more profitable. We wanted a bigger audience. We wanted it that so we would do Panic in the Sky. We would do the different crossover things within our books as a way to generate interest. Like, oh, look, we're doing this thing with Brainiac or whatever. And so that's how it started. And Carlin also was smart, which he may have told you about. He would have house ads for all of the crossover stories produced and sitting in the production manager's office for when any other editor on any of the other DC books would miss their deadline to get a letters page in. If their letters page wasn't in and the book had to go to the printer, production department would just put 2 pages of ads, house ads for the DC books. So Carlin was smart enough to have a house ad sitting there for all of our things. So it looked like, hey, why are those guys getting such great promotion from DC? It wasn't that. It was just Mike was smart enough to know that, if you're going to throw something in here, we want to be house ads for Panic in the Sky or for, what Blaze and Satanis or something. So anyways, we would meet at a story conference to talk about upcoming things. And generally we would try to do a crossover among our books, maybe twice a year at the most. And then we would do our own stories in the intervening issues. So we'd come in, we talked about the wedding. After the engagement, it was going to be this wedding thing. We'd planned out the wedding on the first day. And then I believe we were in the bar at night and Carlin came up to us at the bar and said, I think we're going to hold this because there's Lois and Clark TV shows coming. And this might be something that would play better if we do this at the time of the show. Maybe they'll tie into it. So it wasn't that Lois and Clark told us not to do it, but it was just an idea. Maybe we should hold this because it's legitimately a bigger news type story. Clark Kent and Lois Lane getting married rather than, So the next day we all walk in with ideas, trying to cobble together something for a bigger story. And my memory of it is that Dan Jurgens wanted to do a big fight because we never did the big fights. And pretty much everybody turned it down. It went around the room and then nothing better came up. And I recall just saying, what if we revisit what Dan's, idea about the big fight, like the, Marvel style fight where buildings are collapsed and everything, and instead make it our way and do it so that it's not just abandoned warehouses and, things like that being destroyed, but that it's actually displacing people. It's actually killing people. That has stakes. There's some stakes to it. So everybody was like, whoa, yeah, okay, that and that sounded good. And then it's like, well, we start the fight. And I remember them coming up with the ideas of, different stuff like, oh, this character's buried deep underground and we can do that as a teaser. And it just the fist hitting the ground, boom. And it was like, no, doom, doom, doom. And I remember Carlin going, Doomsday for Superman. That's how I remember it. So we have a name, we have a concept of a big guy coming. Dan, I think Tom Grummett and John Bogdanov were doing drawings of what they thought Doomsday should look like. That's how I remember it, that they were doing like a bake-off. We start talking about the storyline. We start talking about the big fight and everything. Dan was drawing and writing a Justice League book at the time. So I think Dan suggested we could tie that in and maybe see if other DC editors would want to tie into the big fight. And nobody wanted to do it. I mean, that was an after effect later. It was like they probably all regretted it. But so the big fight, and they fight, and it's like, okay, if this is the guy who's going to take, the big, actually give Superman a battle, we have to make this like a big fight. And it also has to feel like, Doomsday doesn't walk away from it. So it's like a fight to the death, that type of thing. And then Carlin, I remember Carlin coming in saying, hey, what about what Jerry always says? Superman dies. Because the side story was we'd walk into these meetings, previous meetings, you'd have a wall full of 16 by 20 sheets of board on the wall that we had to fill in with ideas. And I started doing this thing where I'd say, go to the end board, the last one issue or whatever that month that we had to do. And I write Superman dies, or, at the end. So Carlin is picking up on my in joke of that, doing that. And he just goes, what if Superman dies? And then we're all like, oh, well, how do you get out of that? That seems so big. It's like, we don't have to worry about that right away. And Roger Stern said, we don't know what death is to a Kryptonian. So everybody kind of latched onto that. It's like, oh, okay. So there is some kind of a logical way out of this, rather than how are we going to bring him back from the dead? Like, it's like, oh, he could be technically dead, but maybe not totally gone, but that's how I remember it. I know, I think Wheezy had popularized the idea that let's just kill him or whatever, which is kind of funny, but it's not how I remember it. And it's fine, but I'm sure
See, I got that story twice that you said just kill him. That's I've heard that twice already. So that part's not true.
I mean, it sounds, but again, it was done as an in joke in a couple of previous meetings that we had, where I just to put something on the board in the beginning when there's nothing written down, to write Superman dies on the last one. And so it became, it was a little in joke that became a real thing.
So how was it determined? Because obviously there's a few big moments in the death of Superman. One, that the major moment is issue 75 of Superman, where he literally dies.
Yeah.
How was it determined who was going to write which parts of the storyline?
Well, I think it came down to the anniversary aspect of an issue, and Superman 75 was the, logical round number kind of promotional thing. That's a lot of times that's how it would work out. It's like, well, we know this is going to be something that maybe we can get extra promotion for or whatever. I think that's how the time. I mean, also maybe also in deference to the fact that Dan had the idea of the big fight, but that's how, when we would fill the charts out, when we came in, we weren't starting with issue 1 of anything. So, if you looked at the big chart on the wall, Adventures was probably up to 490. I feel like the Doomsday thing could have been 493 or 94.
It was 497, because I know issues later you had the 500 issue.
Right. Okay. Because yes, but I mean, so you look at those numbers, and that's what you're looking at on the chart, 497. And then if Superman comes as I think Adventures, I don't remember the order of it, but like Man of Steel, Action, Adventures, Superman, if that was it, each of those things has different issue numbers. So we weren't starting on a specific target necessarily, but 75 became good. And then 500 became, like a good number for him to come back to. I don't think anybody really, I don't remember there being a lot of brain power, put to that necessarily. I think from Mike Carlin's point of view, he would try to figure out how long we could get away with having Superman dead, and how long we could do, like the World Without Superman and Funeral for a Friend and all that. So those were kind of planned out to give us that kind of 3-month gap. Because DC would never, when we first said, hey, can we kill Superman? It's like, what? It's like, no, we're going to bring him back. So it's, there were other conditions, but we knew that we have maybe that 3-month thing plus previews or at the time you had previews, and you had Capital Distributor, Diamond, you had one in New Jersey, I can't remember now, but there were multiple comic distributors, all had catalogs, and all would expect to have cover reproductions when they're soliciting, in advance, soliciting sales for those books. So I do remember stressing, it seemed smart to me, and I think it was a smart idea, but I said, if you have previews or any of those books giving away elements, then you're losing some story value. I said, if Superman's dead and he's coming back, that's the one time that nobody knows what Superman will be like when he comes back. So why give it away with a cover, And then Mike said, okay, we'll do the blackout covers, top secret. And that was a cool thing that DC did go along with, because it also, was like we were writing a marketing plan for them with that. You know what I mean? Not that, but it was a marketing plan. It was like, you're selling a top secret thing, and you also help, I think, drive interest in what it's going to be by withholding rather than, showing too much, like a movie trailer would or something. So, but yeah, it was an interesting, I think it was an interesting thing because, everybody working on the books had, I think, a similar mindset and a similar view of Clark Kent and Superman. And that was what I think was really special about our group, was that we were all kind of on the same page as to who Clark Kent is, who Lois Lane is, who Perry White, all of these characters. I think nobody really disagreed on the handling of them. So it would be like having a really well cast TV show, I guess, and having different directors, knowing that the characters are going to be consistent, among multiple episodes, depending on, everybody knowing what an actor is going to do or how they're going to act. So that was a key, I think, was the fact that we were truly a group. And I think we also worked together well as a group. You didn't always get along, but we got along when we needed to, and we genuinely still like each other. I think that's says something,
Now, one interesting as well is your issue, which is part 4 of the 7-part series. You, at the very beginning of the story, you focus a lot on this human character called Mitch, from his perspective, hearing the battle, seeing the battle. What was important about having the battle start through his eyes?
Well, that kind of comes back to how we were planning, or the way to not do what we thought of as just a mindless fight, and to show you would pick a character like this kid and his mom, and his mom had a little girl, so he had a little sister or something, and they literally become homeless because of the Doomsday thing. So I think that ups the stakes, especially in a fight. Comic fans generally like to see those big punches and giant figures and stuff, but you generally don't get a sense of what it's like for someone on the street. It would be like someone in a war zone. There's an inherent danger, but there's also an inherent confusion of what's going on. That was a way to put that in a character's, from a character's point of view. So I think it made it a little more special. Again, that's part of that whole thing of Superman looking down on the city, or Superman standing on the street corner. There's just something, I think, a little more immediate and relatable. So
another interesting question is of Doomsday, who obviously has now had quite a long life now in the world of comic books. He's shown up, reappeared several times. When you were part of the conceptualization of Doomsday, how did you consider him as a character? How did you approach him from a character trait perspective? Because once again, on some level, he's this unstoppable object, but you still got to make him tangible in some way.
Yeah. I think the idea really, I think we were all kind of on the same page about that. At least my memory of it was that Doomsday was like a force in nature. And if you were trying to compare or come up with a comparison, it would almost be someone like Galactus, someone with just amazing power, who very little about, just that, oh, this is really dangerous. It would be like for us, it'd be like some huge hurricane or some huge tornado or something coming through. It's something that's unstoppable, something that you didn't predict, something that you couldn't prepare for. So I think that was the idea with Doomsday, and that's why I think I know I felt like this. I don't know if the others did, but I felt kind of like this was a character like where you would do it like Galactus, but you wouldn't have him come back 6 months later. The idea of Galactus was great the first time around, but then the more you see Galactus, it's like, oh, he's back. You know what I mean? It's not the same as having something that, it loses a little bit of the impact. So with Doomsday, that was my idea. I thought, or at least I thought we were on that page, was that we were just going to do it and kill him and be done with it. So, I mean, obviously that, it was super successful. None of us predicted or could have predicted how big of a success it would have been. And I understand them doing stuff with it. And I understand Dan especially kind of trying to stake it out, because if he didn't do it, somebody else would do it, So from his point of view, I'm sure it was like, oh, I want to come up with an origin. I want to do this. I don't remember what the timing was, but we did a Doomsday annual. I feel like it might have been in 94, but I'm not 100%. It was an annual and it had, I think, 4 different stories in it that told some bit of Doomsday past history. But I'm not sure if that happened after the thing that Jurgens did. He did like a mini series.
Was it Hunter Prey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember when that was, but I feel like there was definitely like a bit of an origin in the Doomsday annual. But I don't remember if that's where Dan first tied it into Darkseid and the New Gods or whatever. But yeah, like I said, I think that character was just something. It was just a big fighting monster that you couldn't seem to stop. There wasn't any subtlety to him. There wasn't any tragic backstory at that point. I think they've added little elements of things in other media. I know the TV show Krypton did something. Superman and Lois this past season 3 added another element, which again was kind of cool. But every whenever this stuff is adapted in another form, it's always going to change somewhat. But I couldn't tell you what the origin of Doomsday is offhand, because Dan did those, and I remember some connection to Darkseid and all that. But over the years, I mean, I can't say I've studied or written notes or anything, but I never got to draw them until I think more recently. So it was, at conventions, someone would say, do a Doomsday sketch. And honestly, I couldn't think of what he looked like. So I remember drawing one thing very horribly. And I said, someone's got to have a phone that they can look it up and have reference or something. And so a guy showed it to me and it was like, oh yeah, I had it totally wrong. But because I was writing it, I really had, you focus on it differently. I think if you draw a character, you kind of have to commit certain things to memory. I can draw characters that I did in, 1982 pretty accurately costume wise. I can do a JSA character, but I did those a lot. So, but it is funny, having to suddenly have somebody say, draw Doomsday. I'm like,
so, I mean, the other thing that's kind of weird from a writing standpoint is that by the 4th issue, you guys were doing the panel countdown thing, where now you had only 4 panels per page, but you kept the 4 panels per page, so every page literally was just 4 panels. How tough is that from a writer perspective, trying to force yourself into 4-panel thinking per page?
It's not, ultimately the fact that those are fight issues, pretty much almost all action. That formatting isn't the big problem. I think you just realize you have 4 times 22. That's your story count. When you're typing out a plot, you might have too much to put in there, so you cut out something. It's not that difficult. I think it might have even actually could have been more difficult as you get to 2 panels and then to 1, even though it would seem like, oh, they got to do splash pages. But that's basically like, like what Dan did. You're at 22 panels, and how do you tell an effective story in 22 panels?
Mm.
So I think the challenge is probably worse the closer you get to that. you know
Well, the other thing is too that because it's a massive fight issue, and it's one of 7 issues of major fight issues. How do you make the fight in your part 4 as interesting as it was on part 1, but not so much so that you have nowhere to go in part 7?
Right. Well, I mean, you just do your best. You know that it's kind of like you're doing round 2 and 3. Someone else is doing 3 and 4. Will the fight go to 6 rounds or 8 rounds? I mean, you kind of know there's a finite point with him going down and being the death happening in Dan's thing. So, in a way, it sounds bad, but most writing is, in a good way. I want to say this: it's filler. It's just making the filler interesting, especially if you're the first part of a story of multiple parts or something. Each person, I think we plotted it out in our charts, was at what stage, because Superman, I think the battle starts outside of Metropolis, then it winds up in Metropolis. Because I think in Action Comics, I remember Roger adding like a wrestling announcer kind of guy, because we were thinking like, the Rumble in Metropolis or whatever. And there was some little ad going on in the background on a TV or something, but it was that, we knew that the fight was from outside of Metropolis to Metropolis, and that's where the big, the death would happen. So you just structure it around that. And the way we used to work, having the outlines on the charts, sometimes Dan would write his story before I wrote my story, or just how the deadlines worked. Sometimes someone was on that first, then you had to maybe make yours line up better if you were the guy who was late, or if you're, what I mean? That happened all the time. And that's part of what Mike Carlin was good at too, was that if he always, everything was read through, and if there was any trouble spots, he found them before they got drawn, so it wasn't always smooth and all that, but it always worked out ultimately.
So in your opinion, was it more difficult to write the death of Superman, the storyline, or was it more difficult to write funeral for a friend that came after?
The Funeral for the Friend and World Without Superman were actually more fun because it was the stuff that had more meat on it. Those were the stories that you could get, that feeling of how much everybody missed him. The fact that even people who weren't friends with him, they still missed it, the presence of Superman, and almost being like a shining beacon. When I was today, I was at the comic store, my local Wednesday stop, and I was talking to somebody about that. And the idea, the whole crux of the Superman death story comes down to the fact that we realized that we were not getting sales or interest among comic store owners. And part of Death of the Funeral for a Friend and World Without Superman becomes almost like a parallel story to the real life aspect, is that when you take something away, people generally feel like, oh, I should have paid more attention. I mean, it's kind of natural when we grieve for people that were close to us that pass away, you think you wish you had more time. I don't think anybody I know has ever gone through like the loss of a parent or whatever, where you didn't think, if only I had one more conversation, so that ties into, the comic stores suddenly going, oh my God, I can't believe they killed Superman. And now everybody's interested in Superman, so it's kind of, there's a weird parallel, but we were preparing that story. That's what the, World Without Superman was going to be about. It was, the comics, we didn't know that we were going to sell out and all that, but the idea is you don't realize what you have until it's gone, and it made Superman, weirdly enough, it succeeded in making him a little more relevant, I think, to the comic stores. But probably more so is that in the whatever 30 years since then, I get people the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years who say, I got into reading comics because of this,
Mhm.
and that's kind of cool because that becomes almost like their touchstone for, it's their Spider-Man walking away from the costume in a garbage can, and that's kind of neat. I mean, those are all things that when I got into comics, I never dreamed that I would have anything iconic like that would mirror what was iconic for me as a kid. So, yeah, it's fun. That's a kind of neat aspect of it.
Now, following Funeral for a Friend, there was the Reign of the Superman series. Now, at that point, Carl Kessel was taking over for Adventures of Superman.
Yep.
With in his each comic had its own version of Superman: the Eradicator, Cyborg Superman, Superboy, and Steel.
Right.
Were you part of the conversations that led to Superboy being in Adventures of Superman?
It was the first part of the meeting, like when we did I believe it was probably either late September or early October of 92. My daughter was just born in September, and I remember my wife brought her to the meeting on the second day because I was leaving early because I didn't have to, stay for that. It was almost like the pass off to Carl Kiesel. So I was there for the return in Adventures 500 and also to figure out that there was going to be four of them. And that was a cool thing too, because again, I don't know what anybody else remembers. My memory of that meeting was that in advance of that meeting, it was again like a bake-off, and everybody came up with, here's who I think Superman would be coming back, and Carlin or somebody was like, hey, these are all good. Why don't we do all of them? And then that became the Reign of the Superman story, kind of evolved from there being four guys rather than just reintroducing one guy and having that one guy in all the books. So it became kind of a bigger story. And I was only there for the intro of that introduction, and the meat of that was done the second day, when I was already gone. But I read that thing as a fan, and I thought it was terrific. I mean, I still think it holds up because I reread it before I worked on this Eradicator story for the Return of Superman special. I reread that whole thing, and I do remember at the time reading it and going, "Wow, they did a great job," because it's hard to that was the biggest thing. It's like you take Superman away, you can't to reintroduce him. It's got to be good because everybody is now looking at this. When we killed him, when we first came up with the idea, we had no concept it was going to sell. And then suddenly it's like the biggest thing ever. So everybody was looking at it, and I think they acquitted themselves really well. It's a terrific story. But again, it became that by virtue of each of the characters, each of the creative teams having a different character, that really was just a really brilliant twist, I think, because it becomes then the fans were speculating. I've been going to comic stores forever. And I remember fans like, oh, which one do you think it's going to be? And you must know. And I'm like, no, I really don't know. But I thought that was a really kind of cool way to keep that interest going, and it also helped pay off the fact that, before you couldn't care less about one guy and now you're really invested in these four guys. So it was kind of fun. It was kind of cool to see that happen.
So what's next for you?
I don't know. I feel like I'm at that point where, the last couple of years I do stuff if someone asks me to. I don't really, I don't get called that often from, DC. Once in a while I'll pitch something. But at this point I was doing JSA. I was working on JSA for, a couple pages in each of the first 6 issues. And I think that's done. They're still doing it. I think my part's done. And I was kind of hoping to get back I've been working on a character from my childhood, Proton, and I've been doing little self-published things that I've been selling at cons, just as a way to make me do pages. Even though I want to do it, I don't have that burning fire. So if there's some other distraction, it's like, oh, it's a beautiful day outside, I'm going to go out and work outside or something. But I also am helping Carl Kiesel and Tom Grummett on their Section 0 1959, which is very late, but there's many reasons for that. And I've been inking Tom Grummett pages to help out Carl, and that's been going slow. Just again, I don't know what the history of that is, but it's a long, big story. I think it's got to be 100 pages or something. I mean, I've inked, I think, maybe a 12 or 13 page chapter. Then I inked a 20-page chapter, and now I'm working on another 20-page chapter. So, but yeah, so I keep busy. I wish I do want to get more work done on my Proton thing, just because I get tired of hearing myself talk about it. But I do covers. I have a variant cover coming on the Alan Scott Green Lantern, the Golden Age Green Lantern issue 2. I did a variant for that. I have another Star Wars. I've been doing some Star Wars variants as well, which is fun because I really hadn't drawn much Star Wars stuff. So it's kind of a change of pace to do characters that you didn't, that you remember, but you're not that associated with. It's kind of an artistic challenge, and they've been really fun to work with. I just did a Book of Boba Fett variant cover. So I've drawn Boba Fett a couple times in the last year, or actually, yeah, last year, and it's amusing. But I also got to draw Han Solo. I got to draw Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Darth Vader, Chewbacca. So it's kind of fun, Other than that, I mean, like I said, I would love to do more stuff for Marvel. I tried pitching a story, Roger Stern, and I tried to pitch a Golden Age Human Torch story, because I feel like I did a Submariner story. I did a Captain America story a couple of years ago. I would like to kind of complete the core Invaders team. But it's fun. I like that era as well. I think, it's sometimes people don't do enough research when they're drawing stuff that doesn't capture the time frame. And so that's something that I like doing. I mean, I find it kind of fun to, I like old movies. So, doing period stuff doesn't scare me. The only thing that would scare me, I think, is having to draw like some kind of battle on horseback or something. But yeah, it's
well. So are you able to talk about Mr. Proton? I mean, about Proton at some point?
What's that?
Are you able to talk about Proton at some point?
Sure.
So yeah, how many issues are completed of him, and is it being sent through Diamond at all and through stores?
No,
or
what I've been doing is I've had like a couple of stops and starts. I was gonna do it back in the 90s, and then it didn't happen. And again, it's a lot of it is that when you're working on your own stuff, no one's paying you a page rate, and you get used to the page rate to pay your bills. So only in the last maybe 2-3 years have I been able to kind of go, okay, I can pay my bills. Now I can spend, some time doing my own thing. So I had done like I think 7 or 8 pages back in early 2000s. And then I had to set it aside, and I wanted to get back to it. In 2017, I think I decided to start working on more pages, and I've done, I think 2 more chapters. So I've probably got a total of 30 pages done so far, with the goal of being able to have pretty much a complete arc of story, enough to put out like a substantial enough book that you could do a Kickstarter for.
Oh, wow. Are you going to?
Yeah, when I got it, because the big issue is with Kickstarters, any of these things, is I always feel bad I don't want to commit to something and then be the guy who's 3 years late on it,
Right.
Because it feels like you should be ready to go with something. Maybe, have it ready within a couple of months, because otherwise you also can't gauge what shipping is going to be. There's a lot of stuff that I think they've addressed that more recently, where you can, like with Kickstarters, if there's a delay, I think they usually save the shipping payment until closer to when the book comes out, So the last couple of ones that I've supported have been like that, where maybe support it and pledge your money in November, and then 8 months later you get a notice that says the book's ready to go, give us your shipping info, and then there's another charge, which totally is needed because shipping rates have they jump rapidly now, especially the last couple of years.
So when you're ready for Proton to go to Kickstarter, can you come back on the show and talk about it?
Absolutely.
It's been an absolute honor to speak with you, sir.
Oh.
And like I said, I love the Superman storyline so much, and I got to, like I said, they're on my. If you ever saw my autograph wall, I got them on my wall. So I just want to thank you so much, and this has been a great honor. So.
Oh, no problem. Thank you very much. I'm glad I could do it.